Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is round one game from the 2016 Candidates Tournament between Viswanathan Anand playing on the white end and Veselin Topalov. This is a tournament involving 8 players. 8 players qualified for this double round robin event. 14 total rounds to be played. And by its end, the winner of this tournament will act as the challenger to Magnus Carlsen in the next World Chess Championship match, to be played later this year, November of 2016. We're going to have a look at one of the 4 games from round 1, this one here, where Anand had the white pieces and opened with e4. Topalov replying e5. Ruy Lopez on board with this d3 system. This avoids the queenless middle game line. This one right here. We don't have that. d3 it is in this game. These next several moves are a bit slow. Natural. Minor piece development. Getting castled. White with c3 is prepping a central break. And so too is black now after knight e7, if given time. Maybe d5 will hit. White hits first with d4, and after the smoke clears, white acquires an ideal pawn center, one that black will be sure to put pressure on in short order by both direct and indirect means. Rook e1 reinforces e4. Black pins the knight now, and so with this, bishop takes d4 is now a threat. This pin is uncomfortable and white wants out. h3. Black is not so quick to take the pinned piece, does not comply, maintains the pin. And now we have a4, so looking to challenge the dark square bishop who is short on squares. The d4 pawn is now all of a sudden poison. The reason being, h3 has already been inserted. If bishop takes d4 right now, notice that in just one swing, g4, the pin is broken, the light square bishop is hit, and the dark square bishop. White is going to win material now. d4 pawn is poison. a6 throws a punch at the bishop. A new square is now available for the dark square bishop. And bishop f1. My first thought when I skimmed through this game was to play to e2 because it breaks the pin, but this drops a center pawn. Black can reply by grabbing the knight. And regardless of how you recapture, one of the d or e pawn will fall. Knight takes bishop, knight takes e. Bishop takes bishop, bishop takes d. So he comes all the way back. You may question why not stay off the back rank and play to c4 or d3. He's a little bit more vulnerable from those two squares. If you're playing to c4, well, actually, you're even running into some disruptive d5 move. So let's say, which would break up the white center. So let's say d3. If bishop d3, this knight can revisit c6, more pressure on d4 now, and just as an example, if you're playing d5, notice these squares can be observed by a black knight. Short story here, the bishop is well placed on f1, out of harm's way. Okay, rook e8, a5, and finally white is now out of the pin and throwing a punch. So how do you defend that b pawn? Black doesn't. Instead looks for an active plan with knight c6, counterstrike at d4. And in one way says, go ahead and take my b pawn, because I'll get your d pawn in return. If this happens, this is a favorable exchange for black. This is a welcome sight for black. They've given up their b pawn, but they got white's extremely valuable central pawn. It's fine for black. It's good for black. White understands this and does not just want to have a b pawn for d pawn exchange, and so instead first says, I'm going to save my d pawn, d5. And only after knight d4 and the exchange of knights, only now I'm going to grab your b pawn. And this is what we had in the game. White is now up a pawn. So, was this a blunder by Topalov? Absolutely not. He understands this. He understood that this would follow, that d5 would be played, and he'd be losing the b pawn, but he's also weighing that he has some nice pieces, and he is likely happy that he has successfully made the white center flinch. The d pawn made a move. Some gaps are now present. Some squares are now available for the black pieces. The c5 square, the e5 square. If black doesn't want to give up the b pawn, he can consider rook to b8, but this is a strictly defensive move. Not a bad move, but a slow, strictly defensive move. This may allow white to maintain that ideal pawn center. For example, let's say queen c3, reinforcing d4. If knight c6, there's bishop to d3, and black is still needing to make that pawn center flinch. They're really well placed, sitting as is on d4 and e4, controlling these four squares in the black camp. By playing knight to c6 at this moment here, you're really putting an immediate question on the white center. I mean, a lot of stuff is happening right away. d4 is hit twice, it's only defended once. e4 is hit twice, it's defended twice, but there's also this issue of at some point black may capture on f3, and after a recapture maybe e4 drops. So there's some immediate pressure placed on the white center. Black wants to make sure that the white center flinches and is open to this idea of giving up a pawn in order to do so. d5 was played, knight d4, and the b pawn falls. In addition to making this center flinch, this is not just a clear pawn advantage for white. There's some more work that also needs to be done for white. The bishop on c1 is not yet playing. The knight on d2 is masking his view of the world. The rooks are currently in a disconnect with one another, potentially tactically vulnerable. Both are unprotected. The e4 pawn is pinned. If the queen is not defending d5, as an example, knight takes d5 may be available. There's still some work that white has ahead of them. They're up a pawn, but they still have some developmental issues. Okay. Knight d7 next, move 18. This observes the c5 square. Many things to say with that knight d7 move. It stops bishop takes a6 for one. Knight c5, that's a fork. Bishop is lost next. The c5 square observes two holes in the white camp, b3 and d3. Possible jumping points for the knight. Ensuing jumping points for the knight. And the knight, now that he isn't on f6, paves the way for the queen to maybe have some voice on the white king side. Queen h4. f2 is also sensitive. One attacker, one defender. Knight c4 was played next. Not the best move in the computer's eyes. There's two top suggestions here by the computer for white. With rook to a3 or even a4, my initial thought with rook to a4 is, well, why would you run right into a fork like that? The computer cites a line where you give up the exchange, but you have really good pieces. You have the bishop pair. You have a pawn for the exchange, and you're restricting that rook as well to defending a6. Computer's eyes, this is close to a pawn advantage for white. Even though from a material standpoint, you would just see it as, okay, black is actually up 1 point, but there's many more factors to take into consideration. This was an interesting line, an interesting suggestion, rook to a4, and another one was simply rook to a3, where the rook will start to help out defending the king side. The g3 square is maybe available for the rook. In the game, it was knight c4, much more natural move, looking to get the dark square bishop developed. And what followed was knight c5, queen c6, which is necessary. You need to play to c6 at that point. You don't have very many options. Your only other option is b4. And you're really asking for trouble because you run into these developing moves, these improving moves. Rook to b8, half open file. You're throwing a punch. Where does she go from here? a3, you're asking for even more trouble. The rook enters. Yikes, something bad is going to happen against the white king. Too many pieces, offside queen. There's already tactics like this, and you can't even play g3 unless you want to get mated. Short story here is that you really shouldn't play to b4 because of this rook b8 idea. One other detail, the only other square at that point after rook to b8, you run into a fork. Queen c6 is best. And next we had black playing knight to b3, which is looking to scoop up the bishops, track down white's dark square bishop. An interesting moment is this one right here. Black could have made this really wild, entered an imbalanced position by capturing on f2. And after king takes, the white king is lured out some. Queen h4 check, g3, knight takes e4. White has to give up the rook for knight, otherwise g3 collapses. So rook takes knight, queen takes knight, and after the smoke clears, what do we have? What is the short story? If there is a short story here, it's white. White is playing with two minor pieces and an exposed king versus a safe black king position and a rook and pawn. Very, very messy. If I'm to take it just a few more moves, computer is looking at g3. This is stopping some queen f3 stuff, queen e1, and very, very messy. In the computer's eyes, it's close to a pawn advantage for black. Tough to work this one out. Tough to say who stands better. Practically speaking, it's really a coin flip. Who is really the better side here? Defensive resources in that of rook a3, and then coming over to the king side, maybe even knight to f3 at some stage. Very, 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 very messy. Tough to say who is really the better side here. Okay, we did not have bishop takes f2, but instead knight to b3, and I wonder if this move was maybe, I don't know. I wonder, I'm just curious how much this move was maybe considered. Bishop takes f2 line. I'm sure it was considered some, but I wonder how much before Topalov really went in for knight to b3, because he is quite fond of acquiring the bishop pair. If he could get in his knight for one of his opponent's bishops, that kind of exchange, he tends to go for that. Places a great value, of course, on the bishop pair, does well with the bishop pair. Just wondering some here as I record. I'm just wondering how if that may be factored in to this decision on move 20 to go in for knight to b3 instead of these complicated lines kicking off with bishop takes f2. Okay, after knight b3, rook b1, and black now with this next move immediately scoops up the bishop, which is not best. to grab the bishop right away, yes, it allows black to have the bishop pair, but at the same time solves many of the problems that, well, I don't know many, but it solves at least one of the problems that white has, or the main problem, which is coordination and getting developed. Knight takes bishop, rook takes knight was played, and these rooks are now connected. There starts to be some nice harmony on the white side. White is still up a pawn in this position. What might have been better, instead of immediately grabbing the bishop, is to put some pressure on the e4 pawn. A move like bishop g6 comes to mind, and this would certainly be a bit awkward for white. A rook on b1 who really doesn't even have a good move. You could go to the corner, but you just get captured. Not a good move. The e4 pawn is in a pin. There's still a disconnect between the rooks. Bishop g6 was a better move, instead of immediately grabbing the bishop and helping white essentially to complete their development. So knight takes bishop it was. Rook on b takes. Rook b8. White scoops up another pawn, now currently up 2 pawns. Black will get one of them back soon. And this is not just any pawn either. Without that black pawn around, we now have white with a passed a pawn. It's a few moves away, if black is not careful. Queen h4 hits at both e4 and f2. White defends f2. E pawn drops. Okay, so now it's just 1 pawn advantage for white. Queen is a little bit out of play here on a6. Knight e3, there's now some new squares for the queen. He's coming back to defend this knight e3 move. Maybe even possibilities for knight f5. So queen to d8. Things have certainly shifted here ever since there was an immediate capture on that c1 square. White is untangling and starts to really be the clear, better side here. This pawn plus really starts to show as an advantage now. Queen comes back. Queen c4. The bishop is currently pinned. Bishop g6. Bishop d3. Light square bishops are exchanged. g3. Rook e4. The bishop is still back to being pinned. This is a useful move too because it provides a new square, a light square, for the king, instead of a dark square where he might be vulnerable. And now gets pushing some. a6. Queen to e8. Rook e2. This is a pretty cool move. This is preventing the quite tempting bishop takes knight move. This may be, it looks like a blunder initially because black is winning a piece and attacking the queen. Well, if black does this at this point, after rook to e2, if black captures the knight, white can simply recapture, and the rook is pinned to the queen. This would be an immediate loss. Check. And you are pushing through. Bishop takes knight, no good. Bishop b6 instead. It's very important to make sure this bishop is still on board. If there is, at this stage, a most efficient defender against white's passed a pawn, it would be this guy here, because he stops this advancing square and still has a voice on or near the white king side. Still has some say on this section of the board, the king side of the board. He's not strictly a defensive piece, is maybe the short story, or the short description for this bishop. Queen d3 was hitting the queen. Rook a8. King g2, queen a4, the queen is hit. Looking to deflect the queen from defense of the rook. rook d4, and white goes in for pawn takes queen. White can consider a move like queen to c2. This was interesting when I was reviewing for this game here. Queen c2 is now attacking the queen, and she cannot move and recapture, or not recapture, but she cannot capture on a6 because there's this sharp move knight f5. And what's going on here? We're looking to enter black's back rank. We're throwing a punch at the rook. And the knight, he is immune from capture. Pawn takes knight, and it's already a mate in 9. Starting with this stuff here, just as an example. Right here, and yeah, eventually it's going to lead to mate. Just taking it out some more. f4, and you even get to pick your favorite way to mate. This would be available instead of grabbing the queen at this point. This was what was played. In the game it was pawn takes queen. If queen c2 and queen takes pawn, this sharp move knight f5 is available. Also note, rook takes pawn is not working because of a fork. So yeah. Queen c2, black would have to do something other than grab the pawn like queen b5, preparing to meet a knight move. Knight f5 wouldn't work because there's then queen takes pawn, but just wanted to highlight that this was an option for white to keep the queens on board, in other words. And we have this tricky tactic with knight to f5 on queen takes a6. Anyhow, in the game, it was pawn takes queen. Some of the advantage was given away with this exchange of queens. Knight c4. Slight pull for white, very, very slight. a5 saves the pawn. He cannot be captured, should not be captured. Bishop takes pawn and rook a1, and you can only defend this pinned piece for so long. He will be lost next. Should not be captured, instead it was bishop d4. In the computer's eyes, it cites bishop c5, but I could see why black would want to play to d4. I believe bishop c5 is better because it maintains pressure on d5. Rook takes d5 can happen next. But on the other side, another way to look at it is the bishop on d4 is helping to defend some squares on the king side, like the g7 square, or coming back to f6. Okay, in the game it was bishop d4. We have a check now. The other rook is entering, and black needs to be very careful here. Looking to crash through with rook takes f7, maybe even getting into the h8 square. Rook c3, knight d2, and we are now at a moment where it is pretty much an absolute must move for black here. There's really only one move that can be played to drag this game on, to still keep this game a fight, and that is to keep the knight off of the e4 square, like immediately. Or in other words, the move f5 needs to be played, and it wasn't. The move played was rook c2, and after the knight gets here, there are just too many issues for black. The knight looking to drop into g5 with check, and the rook coming over here. Things along these lines where the knight is supported on g5 and the rook and knight are delivering mate against the black king. This is too much to bear for black. He needs to be kept out of the e4 square. Rook c2 was played, and after knight to e4, there's not a good move here for black. Computer suggested g5, and that's not going to work out. Rook takes f7. There's still pressure. There's pins. The knight could grab here next. Big trouble for black in that line. The knight needs to be kept off of the e4 square. In the game we had f6, and now we have h4. This f6 move is looking to next play g5, which would provide a new square for the black king. By playing h4, white is basically saying, you could play g5 and have this square open for your king, but I could immediately take it away next by playing simply h5. I don't even have to capture on g5. And there are still these mating nets against the black king that are not long off. As an example, rook f8 and the other rook to the 8th rank, and then rook to h8. Mating nets like that. So from here it's unfortunately busted. White goes in for something quite simple, which is the doubling on the 7th rank. And there's not much to do. If you're kicking the knight, well, I should say it as if you're trying to allow your bishop to defend g7, you are also giving up the g5 square. So you could invite one defender in for to the g7 square, but you open up a new attacker by way of knight g5. g5 is tried, h5. Rook takes f2. This is just desperation at this stage. There isn't really anything to do. Rook takes f2. Black now hunts down the knight. White is looking for mate on h8. The knight is picked up. King h3. How are you stopping rook h8 mate? If you play g6, this runs into a mate in 2 with rook check and then rook h8. So that's not working. What is tried is g4. And then f5, and if the king is going to h3, now at least the king can escape in this way, but after f5, white can simply grab the pawn, and does in this game, and at this stage, black resigned. There's nothing to do here. If you exchange rooks, king takes rook, and this is completely busted for black. This one pawn basically negates those two, and I see this as white actually being up a pawn and the exchange. Doing something other than a rook exchange, well, white once again revisits the f8 square and looks for these ideas. Big trouble for Team Black. There is no hope for black at this point. So, interesting game, interesting start to this candidates tournament. It's round 1 of 14, a long way to go. Each player will play one another twice. One is white, one is black. Feel free to chime in the comment section below. Who would you like to see be the challenger to Magnus Carlsen later this year? In just a little bit, I'm going to put up on the screen the results of the other 3 games, and yeah, feel free to chime in. Who would you like to see be the challenger in the next World Chess Championship coming up later this year? I'm really excited for it. Let me know in the comment section below. Discuss it in the comment section below if you'd like, and I will catch you in the next video. Hope all is well and you got something out of this video. That's all for now. Take care. Bye.